Okay. Welcome to the Giving for a Change web seminar. This is the Saturday morning, July 26th edition. We did this also Thursday night, and I believe that went very well. For those of you who are coming in as guests, as registrants, please note that the presenters will be audible, but we wanted to make sure that the audio was clear, so we turned off everyone else's microphone just for this presentation. If you have questions or comments during the presentation, please go to the left side of your screen where it says chat, and you will be able to type a note there, either addressed to everyone, or you can also choose to send it just to the presenters. Toward the end of our time together, we will revisit that column and go through the questions that people have had and try and get those addressed in meaningful and efficient ways. We're here because the conference is very interested in supporting our congregations in many ways as best we can. I know that we've had some discussions about development, financial advancement on the conference level, and much of that information would translate well to each congregation. So we wanted to share some of what we found and the resources available with those of you out there in the congregational leadership. In the interest of time, we will not introduce the participants online. Just remember, please type in your questions at any time to the left. It won't be an interruption or anything. We will get back to them toward the end. A recording is being made of this presentation, but when people view the recording, chat comments will not be visible. Okay? So let's start our time together with an opening prayer. Creator, Redeemer, sustaining God, we come to you as a congregation of congregations, seeking to effectively live out your kingdom here on earth. Help us to be to each other and to the world the witnesses that you would have us be. We ask for guidance as we plan and execute our stewardship tasks, and ask that we also find the joy that is inherent in service to your kingdom. Bless us now, speak to and through us today, tomorrow, and always. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rich Gerig for presentation. Rich Gerig from Advancement Associates and Brad Miller from Everence are going to be our two primary presenters today. So, Rich?
Well, good early morning to you from Phoenix, Arizona. My wife and I moved here about 11 years ago from Goshen, Indiana, and we're still getting used to Arizona summers. We just survived our latest dust storm last evening, so I'm happy to see the sun coming up this morning and to join you for this conversation. I appreciate your giving the time to join us in this conversation, and I know that each of you carries different levels of responsibility having to do with stewardship, some at the conference level in your congregation as the pastor or maybe on a stewardship team. But I know that all of you are somehow affected by understandings of stewardship, or said another way, you're very involved in important missional activities that depend on the support of people around you for you to be effective in carrying out those missional activities. So we come at this topic of giving from different perspectives, but I know that all of us are directly impacted by understandings of stewardship in the various circles in which we operate. And for me, there are maybe three connections to this topic that create interest for me. One is For a long time, I've been interested in understanding motivations for giving. Why do people give? And there are many, many reasons that motivate people to give, and they can be different motivations depending on the project at hand. And sometimes the motivations, two or three, operate together when people make decisions about giving. But giving as an idea or as an activity has been a topic of interest for me for many years. And then, of course, with the work I do with Advancement Associates, much of our work is with faith-based organizations or denominational entities that in many ways depend on the charitable gifts of their constituents to support the work that they're doing. So over about 30 years, I've had a chance to see this in action as these kinds of organizations, faith-based organizations, have invited people to support the work that they're doing. And my third perspective is as a member of my congregation, chair of the stewardship team, chair of the congregation. That's given me some interest or perspectives on the topic that I'm happy to share also. I know that we only have an hour here, and this is an important topic, and we don't have much time to deal with it. But Brad and I hope that we can at least introduce you to some important understandings that you can carry with you after this brief hour. Included in that, at the end, we're going to give you a list of resources that we've put together that I think can help you in your further thinking and planning related to stewardship. So I recognize that we're just scratching the surface of a very important topic, but we hope to get far enough into it that if you are interested in taking next steps, that we've been able to give you some handles that you can use moving forward as you think about stewardship. So with that, I'd like to give you a quick lay of the land related to what's happening in the U.S. In terms of charitable giving. Here is a chart that this comes from Giving USA data, and if you had a chance to look at, we gave you a Giving USA document that you were invited to look through before this webinar, and I hope you had a chance to do that. These are the same data, the same source. But notice in 1986, of all the charitable giving that was done in the U.S., 60% went to churches or church-related projects. So over half of all the charitable giving being done in this country was given to church. And probably, I don't have the data, but probably in the years prior to 86, the percent was probably even higher. And in 1986, if you then combine charitable giving to all other entities like education or health or human service, you combine all those two, and only 40% was given to everyone else. Well, note what's happened in just a few years. In 2012, the pattern had completely turned around, that only 33% of the charitable gifts were being given to churches or church projects, and 2/3 of all the charitable giving was going to these other worthy causes. And I believe when I put this slide together, I had just 2012 data. I think in the information we gave you prior to our webinar, you have data from, I think, 2013, and I believe the 33% has now dropped to 31%. So a dramatic shift in the organizations that are receiving charitable gifts in our country. And you may have read in the Giving USA document some of the impressions of what's happening. On the church side, it's clear that there's been declining attendance over these years, which would, and attendance is directly correlated to giving, and so I'm sure that's a factor. But however it is, the other factor operating is that donors are increasingly invited or interested in supporting other projects that depend on charitable gifts for meeting their mission. So that's a quick snapshot of what's been happening in a relatively short amount of time in terms of charitable giving in this country. Here's another slide that I thought would be helpful. You notice that I used the word competition there at the top, and maybe you don't like to think about churches competing with other organizations for giving. If that word doesn't quite work for you, maybe think about other worthy causes. But as you likely know, a 501c3 organization would be any, it's an official designation by the government that certifies that an organization is a nonprofit organization, and that donors can support the work of that organization, and then their giving can be considered charitable giving for tax purposes. That's what a 501c3 organization is. And here are some interesting data on the light green bars are the number of congregations in the United States. So the data I have go back to 96 and then up to 2011, and you see that the number of congregations across our country has been flat over that period of time. But the dark green bar then is the number of these nonprofit or these 501c3 organizations, and you see a dramatic change or a dramatic increase in the number of these kinds of organizations. So on the one hand, you have a stable number of churches not increasing. On the other hand, a dramatic increase in the number of these organizations that depend on charitable gifts for them to meet their mission. So, and many of these organizations are faith-based. Another thing that is happening within these numbers is that a number of, I know, for example, Camp Amigo has invited charitable giving for years, but I'm guessing that they are giving that even higher priority, or Bethany Christian, or other worthy faith-based organizations that depend more than ever on charitable giving, and they are responding by more actively inviting support. So within that setting, the church continues to invite support or depend on understandings of stewardship, but there are many, many more nonprofit organizations that are also hoping for the attention of donors. That's another snapshot of the current picture. Back in 2005, I participated in a study for MCUSA where we were trying to learn about giving patterns. Who are people supporting the denomination? So that study was done some time ago, and it was for the denomination rather than individual churches or conference. But in preparation for this discussion, I reread some of the findings of that study and identified some that I think are applicable to individual churches. And here's something you may want to ask questions about. But we found in the study that if giving in the past was assumed, if church giving was assumed, that no longer carries the day. So to have an entitlement activity, mentality that assumes that our people will just automatically give because they should or we tell them to. The evidence is pretty clear that that doesn't work anymore. The importance of focusing on being missional, and that's a word that our Mennonite churches have been working with for the last 10 or 15 years. What does it mean to be missional? We know that for many people who are actively supporting the work of their congregation, it has to do with their understanding that their support is vital for their church to be missional. That's a primary motivation. So being focused on being missional as we invite support is important. It's important to tell our people how their support is making a difference. And this is where these ideas about a narrative budget come in. Communicating more effectively to our people that in fact their giving is making a positive difference, and doing it in a way that they can understand. And often telling stories is an appropriate approach to that. Being sure that the budgeting that we're doing is done well, that the gifts that are offered are being used for their intended purpose, for giving reports at the right time and in a way that are understandable, to have an accurate record of giving within our congregation. Those are all things that are important in terms of stewardship and people supporting the work of our congregations with their gifts. And a large part of our study also focused on the younger generation, the millennials. They are clearly not in the habit of giving like older generations are. And so what are we doing to engage the interest and the support of younger people who, when they give, they want to know how their giving made a difference. They want to see the difference it makes. They want to be communicated with in a different way for their gifts. They're not in the habit of giving, and you may have some questions about that, but I think that's a finding that is likely part of the picture in your individual congregations. Then I have just one more slide before I turn this over to Brad. When you see our resource list, you're going to see a little booklet by Henry Nouwen. I'm sure many of you, all of you know about Henry Nouwen, the Dutch theologian, who in his later years was the director of the L'Arche community in Toronto, a community of adults with developmental disabilities. And in that position, he needed to raise funds. He needed to invite financial support of their mission. And early on, as he learned about this task, the most he could say about fundraising was, it's a necessary but unpleasant activity to support spiritual things. He was cautious about needing to do this. He was uncomfortable with the task. But as he got to know donors and learned more about what motivates their giving and how they did believe in the mission and how supporting L'Arche for many of them was an expression of their faith, later on in his professional life, he had a different understanding, a different perspective about fundraising. And later on, he said fundraising, or I would say stewardship, or inviting people to give money, is proclaiming what we believe in such a way that we offer other people an opportunity to participate in our vision and mission. That's a much more exciting way to understand stewardship and giving. And as we talk together here for the rest of the hour, and as you think about your own situations and your congregations, and try to think about how can we invite people to be even more faithful in terms of their stewardship. Yes, I know we typically don't talk about money, and our attitude has often been one of entitlement, and I'm suggesting that the times are different and we need to respond in different ways. I also encourage you to think about this as an opportunity, as a good thing, as something that can energize us as we talk more actively about money and understand more clearly what motivates people to give, and to think of new ways that we can do this more effectively. So after this day, and as you work with some of the resources that we're going to suggest for you, whatever your current attitude about fundraising is, maybe it's the one that Nowen first had, but I think that being able to understand this as a positive opportunity will be something that will energize you even further for this task. So with those comments by way of a sort of a lay of the land, Brad's going to then talk about how churches are responding to this current picture, and then we will be happy to respond to your questions and then share a list of resources.
Thank you, Rich, for sharing this insightful information on the changes and trends in giving. My own interest in this topic probably originated back when I served as a pastor for a total of 14 years, and then became involved, have worked for Everence for the past 18 years. What has really, I think, sparked my interest in this is the partnership that Everence has with the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving, which is part of the IU Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is located in Indianapolis. The Lake Institute on Faith and Giving is noted for its cultivating congregational cultures of generosity, which in our partnership with them, we offer 2 congregations. And there's a lot of information from that organization that has been helpful in my understanding. And as Rich has mentioned, the question is, how do churches be creative in their response to these changes? One question before we look at these reasons why people give on the slide is to simply ask the question, how does your congregation encourage faithful giving? There was a handout that was mailed out earlier to registrants called 50 Ways to Encourage Faithful Giving. That can be a helpful resource after the completion of this seminar. And what I'm going to share resonate with those 50 ways. But let me begin by first having you ask yourself a question: why is it that you give to the church? Why is it that you give to other organizations? There are reasons why people give, and there are 8 of them listed here. And these reasons are not intended to be identified with, as the only way or only reason that someone gives, but a person can actually have a composite of these reasons for giving. But let's briefly go through these. Loyalty. Loyalty to a congregation or organization. And generally, this is a person who has a history with that organization. Like with a congregation, it could be a member whose parents were founding members, or this sense of loyalty often refers to and is common in those persons who were born prior to World War II. There's also obligation. And obligation is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a good thing in many ways. It's having a sense of duty or responsibility, or having the expectation of being a member. I'm going to do my fair share. That is my obligation. Interestingly, some congregations these days do not take an offering during the worship service, but rather have a box at the back which is intended to alleviate any sense of obligation to giving. People also give out of impulse. Perhaps one of the best illustrations would be the Salvation Army kettle every year during Christmas time. You do not necessarily go prepared to give, but you might pull a few coins or dollars or something out of your purse or wallet and put them in. People come to church and give on impulse, and I mean by that, they know the offering will be taken, but don't necessarily have anything planned. So they will open their wallet or their purse and select a bill, or maybe 2 bills, or whatever it might be. Or you might think of the story who someone expected to pull out a $5 bill and actually pulled out a $20 bill. So that was on impulse. People also plan their giving for each and every Sunday. These folks generally have it built into their spending plan. And perhaps what they are giving is proportionate to their income, whether it be 2% or 5% or 8%, 10%, whatever it might be. Relationships are also very important in why people give. And the primary relationship that is important is their relationship with God through Jesus Christ. There's been some studies, when people have a strong relationship, feel they have a strong relationship with God, they have a tendency to be engaged more fully in devotional practices, reading the Scripture, prayer, daily prayer, and regular worship. And they give out of a sense of thanksgiving and worship to God. And generally those folks are giving in a better way than folks who do not have as strong practices. But other relationships that are very, very important are connections in the congregation, whether they be small groups, a Sunday school class, whether they like to volunteer for a variety of things in the congregation. There's this sense of belonging. Another important aspect of why people give is trust. Trust particularly in leadership. Leadership that utilizes best practices in the handling of the giving that the congregation receives through transparency, through communication, and through those competency aspects of best practices. For example, congregations often do an internal audit, but it is probably one of the wiser things to also include an outside audit. Also, how the offering is counted and who counts the offering and how many people count the offering. Those are just simply a couple of things that factor into that trust factor. Other people give because of change, and there's change. They know that when they give, that something will be happening, lives will be impacted. And as Rich mentioned earlier, this is something that the younger generation is very keen on. And of course, being missional, but helping people better their lives. Other people, some people also give out of a sense of passion for certain ministries or projects, like a youth program, or maybe a local ministry like a food pantry or some other type of community outreach, and even going into third world missions or world missions outside of beyond in the greater world, and they'll give for that. So people are diverse in their reasons for giving and where they give. And I think this leads us into the next piece that we need to think about in understanding why people give, and that is, how does a congregation help people grow in their understanding of giving and their practice of giving? And I think this falls within the whole discipleship, nurture, spiritual formation part of what the church does. And maybe you could also reflect on your own money story. How, when, and where did you learn about giving? And think about the congregation in which you were raised. How was money addressed? How were you helped to grow in your understanding and practice of giving? We begin by realizing that money and giving are spiritual matters. It's part of our life journey with Christ, a part of our faith journey. Some people even describe giving as a spiritual discipline. In 2 Corinthians, Paul talks about this whole concept of sowing and reaping, and if you do that generously, you'll reap generously. You'll reap generously rather. If you do it sparingly, if you sow sparingly, you'll reap sparingly. But probably the key aspect in this text is where Paul says that when you decide, it's a heart and mind matter. It involves a discernment process which includes prayer and conversation. Now, each of us have a variety of influences in our own money story, those things that have shaped why we think we should give, why we give, and so on. Could be our parents, grandparents, our culture, friends, media, advertising, and technology. And my question goes to, how does the church become an integral part of the equation? How does the church today, is the question I asked earlier, how does a congregation help people who are on a faith journey in their congregation understand and practice giving, but also understand the relationship between faith and money. So I'm going to focus on a few tools and some curriculum pieces that you may already be aware of. You may use them in your congregation. These will also be on the resource page, on the conference resource page, and you can click and get more information there. But briefly, I'll refer to them. One is the Freed Up Financial Living course, which originally was part of the Good Sense ministry from Willow Creek. And this particular curriculum involves a teaching DVD. The workbooks are $20 a piece, and the teaching DVD is about $40. So, again, with a teaching DVD, you do need someone to facilitate the class. It's designed to be 6 1 to 1.5 hour sessions. There's also Dave Ramsey and Financial Peace University. And I know that there are folks who have questions about sort of his philosophy and theology about this kind of thing, but he is about budgeting and finances, but he has also helped a lot of people. It's 9 weeks, and I think it's about $109 per person or per couple. I'm not quite sure on that. It varies, I think. There's also Crown Financial, which is a 10-week curriculum with a teaching DVD, which costs $20, and workbooks are, I think, $14 a piece. Everence also has some similar types of resources, which are in a PDF format and often involve the use of Everence representatives along with people from the congregation to teach them. For example, there is a piece called Household Finances from a Christian Perspective, which is designed to be taught in 4 2-hour sessions or 8 1-hour sessions. There's also Becoming One Financially, which would be a good piece to work with couples who are engaged or married and so on. Then there's also Creating a Cash Flow Plan, which is a basic budget or spending plan piece that helps people think through their income, what they're giving, where their expenses are, and so on. So those are some things that Everence has to offer. Now, what are the opportunities? Well, I think you can realize what these opportunities would be. Let me just highlight a few for you. There could be an elective class, a small group, or a Sunday school class, a place where there's an opportunity to talk about money in a good way and to hear each other's stories. Often when I've done things with congregations, especially during Sunday school, I've used something called the money autobiography. And this goes back to where people have learned about money and how they practice and why they practice and think about and use money. I think preaching and teaching is essential regarding the biblical perspective on money, because Jesus had a lot to say about it. And I think it's helpful for us to think about this biblical perspective on being the good news of generosity and giving, and perhaps also the good news of receiving in order to give. Other avenues would be membership or baptismal classes, as you talk about what it means to be a member of the congregation, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. What does that mean then in terms of giving of your time, your talent, your money, and talking about those things? Another avenue would be premarital counseling, which pastors often do. Now, there's one aspect I'm going to end with here on opportunities, and that is every congregation has 52 teachable moments every year, and that is the offering during worship. And I think we sometimes minimize that opportunity. It's my own perspective. It often feels like the offering is sort of the hiccup, that place between the opening songs and the worship songs and the sermon. And so we give a brief amount of time to that often. Now, maybe your congregation doesn't, and that's fine. But it's something that I've observed being in congregations, part of my own congregation. But this is really a significant opportunity, and it doesn't have to be long. Making a very appropriate comment, sharing a scripture, a brief story or testimony or illustration related to generosity and giving, and then a thoughtful prayer. And I think it's helpful for us to help our worship leaders understand this significant opportunity. One way that churches I've observed over the years how offerings are taken is that ushers will come forward from the back and they will be invited to receive the morning offering. Hopefully the word lift is not used much anymore, but they come forward to receive the morning offering. Generally, it's somewhat silent until people the ushers reach the front, and then a prayer and perhaps a song. And I've often thought, and because we do it that way in our congregation, what would happen if we would begin with taking the offering from the back? In other words, don't have the prayer prior to the offering, but have the ushers begin receiving the offering and moving forward, and then when they get to the front, offering a prayer of what has been given during that particular time. I think that would be a good way of celebrating and highlighting the importance and significance of this part of the worship service. Could also be done by utilizing other ways, like from other countries, where people come forward with joyous singing, and they come to the front and deposit their offering in the basket and go back, and it can be a joyous thing. But thinking a bit outside of the box, what might work in your congregation? I think we need to remember that the reason for giving and for receiving an offering on Sunday morning is to further enhance, to invest in the ministry and mission and vision that God has given to each particular congregation. And sometimes I have the sense that the reason we give and the reason we have an offering is so that we can meet the church budget every year, when in fact there's nothing in Scripture that talks about meeting the church budget. Now, there are other avenues that you could pursue, and I'll talk a bit about those at the end. One would be the generosity seminar, and then there's another piece on 6 best practices that would be in those resources. But as you think about how you nurture people, then we need to think about how do you provide ways to give. The offering envelopes are generally used in congregations and people write checks or give cash. It may be the most common way that offerings are received. However, we also understand that nowadays many people are writing less checks and moving toward technology. So on your church website, give an opportunity for people to give online through a debit card, credit card, and make it easily accessible. Or you might want to inform and educate your congregation on how to utilize automatic withdrawal from their checking account or savings account, which goes then to the church account. Or you may have heard of the QR code, which stands for Quick Response Code, and this is something that you need to have a smartphone in order to access or to utilize. I've worked with a congregation who utilizes a little a QR code, which is a square box that looks black and white with 3 little boxes in the corner and sort of a matrix of characters in the middle. And you have to, and here's what's in this church bulletin. Scan here to give your tithes and offerings online. Or you can give with a debit or credit card on your offering envelope. Found that interesting. But again, younger generations are quick to use their smartphones for these kinds of things. Also, what you can consider encouraging people to give charitable gifts through the Mennonite Foundation, through a donor-advised account. For example, my wife and I in our will have designated not just the church, but we want a portion to be given to the foundation, and then we will identify the percentages that will go to our congregation and to 2 of the colleges that we attended. Last of all is to just think about an active congregational endowment fund. Now, I think as a church we've been hesitant to talk much about this because an endowment is seen as holding a pool of money for future use, and they'll be holding that for a long period of time. But I read a perspective from a congregation out east which has multiple endowment funds. They view the endowment funds as a river, not as a pool. And I think that's very, very important if we want to establish, or a church wants to establish an endowment fund. Now, the importance of an endowment fund would be that it gives people the opportunity to give to areas where they have a passion, or the church has a passion and their passion lines up with that. So education, music, mission, outreach, camp, and things that are then given out in the form of scholarships. The fund or funds are administered by a 3-member board from the church, but the funds themselves are managed by Mennonite Foundation. And of course, there always need to be guidelines for the use of those particular funds. So I share this as simply share these as some ideas for congregations. I know that there are a number of congregations who already have an endowment fund or funds, and I think the appropriate way to deal or to think about this, if it would work for your congregation, is to simply get some information from Mennonite Foundation have a representative come and talk to you about how these works, because again, the foundation does manage those, often manages those funds that congregations have. So at this particular point, I'll turn this over to Greg. I think there have been some questions here on the chat screen, and allow him to, because I'm sure you would have questions related to what I've said and what Rich has also said.
Thanks, Brett. We do have a number of questions, and I'm going to try and work through them in order. Some may be partially in context at the time, so bear with me. There's a question about when you say church, does it mean membership or number of church groups or congregations? I think we're talking about church things as opposed to congregational. Is there any clarification when you folks were talking about that? Maybe not. Oh, okay. All right. That may have already been addressed. Income disparity is wide in our society. Congregations are best at engaging the middle. How do we engage people at higher and lower income levels?
I'd like to take a crack at that, Greg. I remember something in this Nowlin booklet that we're going to say more about in a bit. The quote is something like this: often our concern for the poor may carry with it a prejudice against the rich. This was Nowlin talking about his perceptions of wealthy people, that often wealthy people can be lonely. Wealthy people often feel like people relate to them using the lens of their wealth, that they may not feel very comfortable in a church setting because of a perceived prejudice against wealthy people. Nowlin has an interesting section about understanding rich people, and I think you'll find that helpful in terms of a way to think about rich people, people of wealth in your congregation. That in many ways they are poor, that they do have motivations for giving that are very positive motivations, but they'd like to be related to in a way that is meaningful to them. And for people that don't have wealth, my notion there is they should still be in the habit of giving. Maybe they don't have much to give, but the importance of giving, I think, applies to people regardless of their income level. And so I would encourage a church, as they invite people to give, not to assume that those without much money can't give or shouldn't be expected or invited to give. And I also, you might want to think more carefully about how is it that you're relating to those that do have a lot to give.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right on, Rich. I know some of the things that we have talked about in the generosity seminar is should the pastor know who gives what, and how does pastoral care come into, for example, a person of means, of wealth? How do we provide pastoral care for all groupings, if you will, or age groupings, if you want to put it that way, or the wealthy or the middle class or those who are poor? And I think there needs to be a way, I don't know quite, I mean, this is something again, each congregation needs to think through how they're going to do this, because when you shoot for the middle, you're going to miss, like you said, those who are at the high end, and then discourage those who are at the low end. So how do we find ways to give where people are, and sometimes to challenge those who are of capacity, and I mean in a good way, through pastoral care. I've read already that, people won't give to projects unless they're asked. So a church, there might be the expectation that I have a high capacity person in my congregation, and the expectation would be, well, that person will give to this particular project and give significantly, and then does not, or however we might learn about that. So I think it's important. I remember a story of a congregation, a large congregation actually, out east somewhere, where they had a whole mix of people from those of wealth to middle class to poverty, and people on assistance and so on and so forth. And that congregation managed, this has been a while back, that congregation managed to at least find ways of encouraging all people to give at whatever place they are at. And then I also understand that this congregation had a celebration banquet for all givers, and regardless of amount. And I thought that was sort of a cool idea, to celebrate and say thank you for all who have participated in supporting the ministries of the congregation.
Interesting. So what about the millennials? I mean, we talk about those in development circles. This generation, or generations, millennials and following, are there specific ways to engage not just the older, established, more well-to-do in some cases, but rather the younger, the people who may not have the affiliation or may prioritize giving to nonprofits? How can we best reach out to millennials?
I think, I think we need to engage in conversation to find out what their interests are and why they give. I can say these things generally speaking, but what does it mean for millennials? And I think it's important, at least as I'm thinking about it, as I'm older and wiser, that probably these conversations need to happen in a variety of ways with all people in the congregation, because I think we speculate sometimes why people give and wonder why there isn't more. But to really think about what and find out from millennials, what is it they're interested in? I mean, in general, we know that they're interested in things where there is change and those types of things. Justice issues may come into that as well. Now, Rich, you may have had some specific experience with that, but that's just an observation that I would make, and part of my intention along the way here has been to engage millennials, and that hasn't happened in my time or in the past several years.
Well, when I saw this question, I went back to some of this research we did, and here's my list of findings related to millennials. Number one, as I say, they're not in the habit of giving, and we found that millennials as a group, the concept of a tithe is a new concept to them. So the point is there some teaching to be done about what is the concept of a tithe? Why is it an important practice to consider? So educating millennials was one point. A second point was they want to be communicated with in different ways. So when Brad was talking about ways to invite people to practice stewardship, these people are much more acute into social media, and we find that the millennials would like the church to offer as many ways to give as what they can do when they go to their bank in terms of technology. In other words, making it easy to give, using social media to give. That's important to millennials. Another one is they want to be involved. And so are there projects your church is supporting in the local community where people not only can give money to support it, but actually be involved? That would be important for millennials, to actually be involved, not just giving their money, but they're very hands-on. I've said before that they want to know that their support is making a difference. So how, either through stories or chances for involvement, can you help them understand that their support is making a difference? And the last thing on my list is ask them. Ask them what are ways that our congregation can more effectively invite your support. I think they'd be happy to. They're very relational. They're very experiential. They're very pragmatic. So along with some of those attributes that we can identify, I suggest that you invite them to tell you how you can be more engaging of their interest.
That's great. I think I think that answers a number of the questions related to millennials, and also leads us into the next question, which is to engage new people in giving. Their leaders are going to need to be willing to have face-to-face conversations. Now, this is sort of where the rubber meets the road. What are appropriate ways to do this? If we're not in the practice of going out specifically to meet with people about their financial support, about stewardship, how do we create a context where this is okay?
I think and I referred to it earlier, I think this answers the question. There's a tool that's called the Money Autobiography, and it asks a series of questions like, your household you were raised in, when did you first learn about money, what was your first job, how much did you earn, and it goes through a variety of questions that are really down to earth. And this is the tool that I've used in Sunday school classes. However, Sunday school classes often are there's not sufficient time. You're maybe, you can if you have 40 minutes, you're fortunate. And but I think there are ways of starting conversations which are non-threatening. And at least that's what I found in the churches that I've done this, when asked to do something on a Stewardship Sunday and have a sermon and so on. But then to do that within the class session and have it an intergenerational kind of thing, not just one Sunday school class, but invite a multitude or a variety of people to be part of that. I just think we need to find ways to have these conversations which are non-threatening and can be life-giving and bring understanding. When I've had these or conducted these brief conversations, there's always been laughter and resonating with what people say. Now, maybe it doesn't go to the depth of someone's hurt when it comes to finances and maybe having faced bankruptcy or some other types of challenges or overspending, but somehow we need to find those ways to initiate that conversation. And maybe it needs to start with your church board. Begin having conversations there, and then begin to have that spread out through the congregation, and because the church board can testify, or elders, whomever, can testify, give a testimony, a story of what this has meant and how helpful it is. I think that's part of the learning and growing process that we can initiate, and not feel that money is taboo in our congregation. I think sometimes money is the great silent subject, but it's also it's not really very silent when people can have strong opinions about where the money should go and how the money should be utilized. That somehow that needs to fit in this whole process with the mission, the vision that God has given each congregation. Sort of an overall kind of observation.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between an endowment as a river or as a pool?
Well, since I brought that up, I know a little too much to be dangerous, but I don't know enough to fully explain. Other than how I understand this is that, as I mentioned when I started with that slide, is that congregations, and I'm thinking now of maybe some mainline congregations because I've heard some issues that mainline congregations are having. They've established an endowment for whatever reason. So it's become a place to accumulate money and to also distribute, but maybe not on a regular basis. And what has happened for those congregations is that it has become a funding pool for the general items in their budget because they don't have enough income for that, so they're offsetting, or they're supplementing rather, what what they needed to have in the past. So that's a bad practice. When I think of, and how I understand an endowment being a river rather than a pool, simply means that there's the frequent use of that endowment. In other words, on a regular basis, and whatever that means. Again, a Mennonite Foundation representative could better describe what that means. But to me, what I understand it to mean is that the endowment does not become simply a holding pool of money to be distributed at some time. True, the endowment needs to be built up over time, but that's where congregations can encourage, where there's communication about how this is part of our mission and how this is part of our vision and how we want to use it, so that money not only comes in, but money goes out in the form of scholarships or however it's set up to do over a period of, in an ongoing kind of way. That's how I understand it.
Okay. Now, I mentioned something there. It's a little self-conscious because I'm faithful in giving. I have Everence has a bill pay system that if you give to your church using the automatic bill pay, the bill pay service is free for you. So I do that, and the difficulty, especially because our family, for whatever reason, sits close to the front of the church, we consistently pass the plate on with no apparent additional content. And I'm concerned about that because, especially as church leaders, it's important for us to be seen as providing support. Any suggestions?
Yeah. Some churches have printed out, and I'm not sure where they got this exactly, or have designed a piece that can go in the offering plate that says, I have given my, I don't want to say tithe, but I have given to the church through through an automatic withdrawal kind of thing. That would be one way. Another way I think of is continue to use the offering plate and just write on the offering plate, or on the envelope that you have given. So you still put something in the offering plate. So, you can still do that. It's hard. Your concern, Greg, is legitimate, and because there is that visible action that happens during the offering, and so what happens if everybody goes to automatic withdrawal? It's something that has to be contemplated and discussed, and how are we going to do this, and how will it work?
Okay. Well, we are quickly running out of time that we had allotted. There's another question. Do you find Nowan made a significant shift in his thinking about fundraising? In your work, do you find or cause people to make such a shift in their thinking about fundraising? I mean, is there something that we can do as congregational leaders, as people involved in stewardship, to help people also make that transition?
Yes. I've mentioned before that there are many, many motivations that operate when people think about making a charitable gift. And some of the motivations maybe would strike you as maybe not some of the higher motivations, like they give for tax purposes, they give for ego reasons. Well, that maybe is effective for some organizations when they invite charitable gifts. But if you're talking about the church or faith-based organizations, you need to understand that for most of your givers, the motivation has to do with their understanding of their faith or spiritual development. That's what's motivating their giving. And I think what happened for Nowen was, I think he carried some of the old images of wealthy people and why do they give, and he was intimidated by that, or he was uncomfortable with what he thought their motivations were. Then as he met them and learned a bit more about why do they give, what motivates their giving, I believe he was impressed that among other motivations, their strongest ones had to do with their understanding of faith, of their spirituality, and that's why, in fact, he called it a spirituality of fundraising. And I think those of you who are involved in your congregations or other faith-based activities need to understand that that is a primary motivation for your givers. And I think that understanding will give you a whole new perspective on asking, thanking, challenging, inviting. That's the shift that I think he made. And I think as you think further about some of these things we're talking about, understanding that that is a primary motivation will take you to a whole new level of thinking about these things.
Okay, well, I think we have pretty much covered what we were going to cover, except for the resources. I know we're going to go a little over time with this, but Brad, would you take a few minutes to go over the resource list we have to provide?
Okay, sure. Okay, and I'll try and do this fairly quickly. A number of these resources are resources that I've had in my library here at Everence, and in fact, I've made them part of my personal library, so they will go with me when I leave on August 15th. I really highly recommend First Fruits: A Stewardship Guide for Church Leaders by Robert Hirschbrink. This would be an excellent piece for a leadership group to use as a part of their meeting, for example, however often they meet, for a few minutes. There are 27 chapters now, but the chapters are only 3 to 4 pages, and there are discussion questions at the end. The book is only a total of 124 pages. Stewardship for Vital Congregations by Anthony Robinson is sort of helps to give a bigger picture of what's happening, much of what we've talked about today, but also has 10 chapters with some good discussion questions at the end. That's only 110 pages. Bounty: 10 Ways to Increase Giving at Your Church. That is written by two younger authors. It's 127 pages. They talk about giving being grounded in gratitude, revealed in prayer, and lived in faith. And then Giving to God. Let me go back to Bounty: 10 Ways. With those 10 chapters, there's discussion and an action list at the end of each of those. Giving to God, Mark Powell talks about giving as an act of worship, expression of faith, spiritual discipline, and faithfulness. That could be used by a small group. Could be used by a leadership group as well. Then we go to next here, Jesus and Money by Ben Witherington III. This would be an excellent book for pastors in terms of sermon development, getting some background on the context of Jesus' day, Paul's day, so on. And this gives I think a better framework, context for us to talk about money in the congregation. Rich, would you talk about the other two there?
Yeah, I've made reference to the Nowen booklet, and it takes you an hour to read. I carry it with me wherever I go to remind me of the kind of fundraising that I'm interested in. I commend this to you, and we're going to give you a reference, a way that you can have that on your shelf, and I commend that to you. The Christopher book, actually there's a companion book called Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, and then the follow-up, Whose Offering Plate Is It? Christopher is a Methodist who was a Methodist pastor, and then later on became a fundraising consultant of all things. And so he takes a new look back at how is it that we are inviting, how are we talking about stewardship? How are we inviting financial gifts within the congregation? And he has an interesting, it's very to the point, what he thinks ought to be happening in churches, a list of specific practices that a church would employ if they understood stewardship in this way. These two books were recommended to me by a Church of the Brethren leader a couple years ago, and I find them very practical, very hard-hitting, and coming from a person that understands stewardship from a pastoral perspective, but also from a fundraising perspective. So I think you'll find those useful.
Okay. Is there anything else that we? I'm not thinking of anything. I just wanted to say thank you for all the folks who have taken the time to join us. When this meeting closes, you will be taken to a very short exit form. Once you complete that form and submit it, you will be redirected to a page of additional resources related to this topic. That will include a number of resources we talked about on Thursday night, and a couple of things that came up today, like the money autobiography and the electronic giving slips for the offering plate. So that will be there for you to access. Some of the links are simply going to connect you with a place where you can purchase some of the resources, and others are actually to the resources themselves. More information will be posted on that page in coming weeks, so please bookmark it. We will include links to these presentations so you can see them again at your leisure, because, you know, that's just a fun time right there. I want to thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and we hope this has been helpful to both you and your congregations. May God bless each of you as we together joyfully follow Jesus. Have a wonderful week. Take care.
Thank you, Greg.